Good morning, History 102, and welcome to Chapter 20 of Give Me Liberty. This one covers the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, and the lead up to the Great Depression. In May 1920, at the height of a Red Scare, police arrested two Italian immigrants alleged to have participated in a Massachusetts robbery at a factory in which a guard was killed. The accused, Nicola Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartholomew Vanzetti, an unskilled laborer, were anarchists who hoped for a society without government, churches, and private property. They saw violence as an appropriate means for enacting social change. But very little evidence linked them to the crime. Eyewitness testimony was contradictory, and other evidence was disputed. Nonetheless, in the anti radical and anti immigrant atmosphere of the Red Scare, their conviction was inevitable. When the men were found guilty and sentenced to death, their multiple appeals garnered international attention and sympathy. A movement to save their lives attracted support from many people in the United States, including Felix Frankfurter, a future Supreme Court justice. The governor of Massachusetts responded to protests by appointing a commission headed by Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard University and a longtime official in the Immigration Restriction League. The commission upheld the verdict and the death sentences, and on August 23, 1927, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in the electric chair. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti exposed much about America in the 1920s, from the Red Scare's erosion of civil liberties to the cultural divisions sparked by immigration, as well as the seeming triumph of capital over labor in a decade of apparent prosperity. Even though the decade has been called the Jazz Age and the Roaring Twenties, signaling its innovations in music, sexually liberated women, the roaring stock market, and a flood of consumer goods, not all Americans welcomed the emerging secular and commercial culture. Some feared ethnic and racial diversity and what they saw as the moral degradation of urban life, and they expressed their apprehension in anti immigrant and religious sentiment. This is one of a series of murals painted in 1930 and 31 by Thomas Hart Benton under the overall title America Today. Changing West depicts some of the transformations occurring in that region, including oil exploration, factory development, and air travel. Today, we're going to be talking about the business culture of America and how that got started, as well as its relation to government. Then we'll go over the birth of civil liberties, which led to culture wars, and finally end with the Great Depression. Our first focus question: who benefited and suffered in the new consumer society of the 1920s? The chief business of the American people, said Calvin Coolidge, who was president after Warren G. Harding's death in 1923, is business. Economic expansion, partnership between businesses and government, and business values seemed greater in the 1920s than at any previous point in American history. After the post war recession receded in 1920, the decade was one of extraordinary prosperity. Productivity and output skyrocketed as new industries, such as chemicals and electronics, grew, and older industries adopted Ford's moving assembly line. Automobiles so stimulated economic growth that auto factories, not iron and steel mills, came to embody American industrial power. Car production tripled in this decade. General Motors surpassed Ford, and by 1929, half of American families owned cars. The auto industry sparked the growth of steel, rubber, oil production, road construction, and other economic sectors, and promoted tourism and the expansion of the suburbs. In this decade, America's multinational corporations also extended their penetration of international markets. The dollar became the most important currency in world trade, and American industry continued to lead other nations in output. In the 1920s, for the first time, consumer goods became attainable by most Americans. Goods made available by credit and installment buying plans, such as vacuum cleaners, telephones, washing machines, and refrigerators, transformed daily life. Advertising and marketing professionals found new ways to compel Americans to purchase these items from the new industrial cornucopia. Americans spent more time on leisure activities, from vacations to sports and movies. Radios and phonographs brought mass entertainment into private homes and birthed a new celebrity culture. A French visitor, Henri Siegfried, wrote in 1928 that a new society had emerged in which Americans valued their standard of living above all else. Americans' willingness to amass enormous debts in order to purchase consumer goods seemed to replace 19th century values of thrift and self denial. Work, once seen as a point of pride and skill or collective empowerment in trade unions, now seemed only a means to pursue individual fulfillment through consumption and entertainment. This is a picture of Sacco and Vanzetti outside the courthouse in Dedham, Massachusetts, surrounded by security agents and onlookers. They're about to enter the courthouse where the judge is going to pronounce their death sentence. This chart shows the growth of consumption in electricity and various household appliances between 1900 and 1930. As electricity entered the home, so too did appliances that needed electricity. This spread of the telephone network hastened the nation's integration and opened further job opportunities for women. This is a photograph by Lewis Hine of a telephone operator in the 1920s. Most of these were women entering the workforce and making money on their own for the first time. Despite the abundance of mass consumer society, the fruits of economic expansion were very unequally distributed. Real wages rose by 1/4 between 1922 and 1929, but corporate profits rose at more than twice this rate, and economic concentration continued, with a smaller number of firms and banks controlling greater shares of industry and finance. In early 1929, the share of national income of the wealthiest 5% of American families exceeded that of the bottom 60%. The majority of families had no savings, and 40% of Americans lived in poverty, unable to enjoy the new consumer economy. Improved productivity allowed goods to be made with fewer workers, and while employment grew in some sectors, such as retail and education, manufacturing employment dropped significantly for the first time in American history. Deindustrialization began in the old industrial Northeast as business moved south to take advantage of cheaper and non-union labor. Farmers were also excluded from this prosperity. American agriculture had reached its zenith in World War I, when Europe's need for food and government policies had kept farm prices high. But increasing mechanization and the use of fertilizer and pesticides elevated the output even as world demand stagnated, steadily reducing farm incomes and compelling tens of thousands of farm foreclosures. In the 1920s, for the first time in U.S. history, the numbers of farms and farmers declined. Extractive industries such as mining and lumber also suffered from overproduction in the world market. Even before the 1930s, rural America was suffering from economic depression. The decade of the 1920s, however, was not simply a period of decline, but also one of significant technological change. The mechanization of agriculture accelerated dramatically, and new inventions like the steam tractor and disc plow encouraged an increase in the scale of agriculture. The increase demanded a workforce, and the far west's impoverished labor force was mainly supplied by Mexicans. On the Great Plains, extensive plowing and ignoring of environmental risks set the stage for the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Here we see a family of potato growers in rural Minnesota. Farmers like this did not share in the prosperities of the 1920s. Instead, farmers like these Kansas agricultural workers who were breaking new ground with disc plows. Disc plows eased the task of readying the sod of the Great Plains for planting and encouraged the emergence of larger farms who could invest in much more expensive equipment on credit. Simon Fishman, a Jewish farmer known as the Wheat King in a jacket and tie, is on the last tractor in this photo. Although high unemployment crippled much of Europe in the 1920s, America's high wages, efficient industry, and mass consumption projected a magical image of American wealth and permanent prosperity across the world. The Committee on Public Information's propaganda campaigns during World War I persuaded advertisers that it was possible to sway the minds of whole populations, and many businesses established public relations departments to defend corporate practices and win over a distrusting public. They successfully changed public attitudes towards Wall Street. Congressional hearings from 1912 to 1914, held by Representative Arcee Pujo of Louisiana, had exposed big Wall Street banks' manipulation of stock prices and strengthened popular views that investors were being fleeced in the stock market. By the 1920s, however, with stock prices rising, the market gained more investors, and by 1928, 1.5 million Americans owned stock, more than any previous time in U.S. history. With the defeat of the 1919 labor revolt and the dissolution of wartime regulations, businesses used the language of Americanism and industrial freedom against unions. Some corporations in the 1920s adopted new styles of management called welfare capitalism, in which they offered employees private pensions, medical plans, job security, and leisure programs. These businesses celebrated the attention to the human factor of industry. But more employers adopted the American plan, whose basis was the open shop, a workplace free of government regulation and unions, except in some cases, company unions that were created and controlled by management. They believed collective bargaining infringed on the liberties of management and argued that prosperity depended on providing complete freedom to business. Public relations campaigns linked unionism with socialism and sinister foreigners, and even the most foreign-looking companies hired strikebreakers and detectives blacklisted union members to prevent or defeat unions and strikes. In this hostile environment, unions lost more than 2 million members and capitulated to employer demands in order to prevent their annihilation. This is Charles Sheeler's photograph of the interior of Henry Ford's River Rouge auto factory. It exemplifies the machine age aesthetic of the 1920s. Sheeler found artistic beauty in the giant plant, which employed 75,000 workers. Only one, however, is visible here, and he's dwarfed by a giant stamping press. What interests Sheeler is machinery, not man. This is one of Sheeler's paintings of the River Rouge plant titled Classic Landscape, which seems slightly ironic since landscapes traditionally emphasize scenes of a natural environment. Like unions, feminists tried to adapt to the new conservative atmosphere of the 1920s. Suffrage in 1920 had ended the ties of solidarity that united various groups of women reformers. Black feminists now insisted that the movements demand enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the South, but white activists offered little support. Long-standing divisions between two competing conceptions of American freedom, one based on motherhood and the other based on individual autonomy and the right to work, now took shape in a debate over an equal rights amendment to the Constitution, which was advocated by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. The proposed amendment would eliminate all legal distinctions, quote, on account of sex, end quote. Paul argued that now that women had the right to vote, they no longer needed special legal protections and instead needed equal access to employment, education, and other opportunities. But women reformers who supported mothers' pensions and laws limiting women's work hours, which the ERA threatened to dismantle, vehemently opposed the ERA. Every major women's organization other than the National Women's Party opposed the amendment. The ERA campaign failed, and in 1929, Congress repealed the Shepard-Towner Act of 1921, which had offered federal assistance programs for infant and child health. An emphasis on pre-war feminism on personal freedom blossomed in a growing consumer society, and women's liberation became a lifestyle promoted by advertisers and mass entertainment, which was detached from the political and social radicalism. Sexual freedom now meant individual autonomy or personal rebellion. The young, single flapper who smoked, danced, sported short hair and skirts, and used the new birth control devices came to symbolize the new woman. These new freedoms ceased once American women married, and they now sought freedom within the confines of the home, using new labor-saving appliances such as vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and washing machines. This is Tipsy, a 1930 painting by Japanese artist Kobayakawa Kiyoshi. It illustrates the global appeal of the new woman of the 1920s. The subject, a moga, modern girl in Japanese, sits alone in a nightclub wearing Western clothing, makeup, and hairstyle, accompanied by a cigarette and martini. The title of the work suggests that Kiyoshi does not entirely approve of her behavior, but he presents her as self-confident and alluring. Japanese police took a dim view of the modern women, arresting those who applied makeup in public. Many American authorities were no more welcoming to new women. Here we see the superintendent of public buildings and grounds in Washington, D.C., where it had been decreed that women's bathing suits must fall no higher than 6 inches above the knee. Here in 1921, he enforces his edict, yes, by actually putting a tip measure to her leg and measuring how high the swimsuit was. That's a real thing that happened, ladies. Advertisers marketed cigarettes to women as symbols of female independence. The August 27th, 1925 cover of Life magazine shows a young man and a young woman dressed identically at a beach in revealing bathing suits, by 1920 standards anyway. Both are enjoying cigarettes. Here we see an ad for a washing machine that promises to liberate women from the slavery of everyday laundering at home. Our next focus question. In what ways did the government promote business interests in the 1920s? Better focus question might be in what ways didn't they? The 1920s saw a disintegration of progressivism as many viewed the interest in consumer purchasing as replacing the emphasis on the public good. Increased consumption coupled with shrinking election turnout convinced some people that most Americans had shifted from being informed citizens to private consumers who were uninterested in the affairs of government. Government policy reflected the pro-business climate of the decade. Business lobbyists dominated the National Republican Party conventions, calling on the federal government to lower taxes on personal income and corporate profits, maintain high tariffs, and reinforce employers' anti-union campaigns. Some believed that Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge appointed so many pro-business members of the Federal Reserve Board, Federal Trade Commission, and other progressive-era agencies that they seemed to repeal the regulatory state altogether. The government resumed issuing court injunctions to halt strikes, as it did with the walkout of 250,000 railroad workers in 1922. Under William H. Taft, who was appointed Chief Justice in 1921, the Supreme Court stayed extremely conservative, and a return to laissez-faire jurisprudence diminished progressive policies that had enhanced federal power. This was actually considered by Taft to be one of his best and most lasting legacies, rather than the presidency itself. In 1923, the court struck down Muller v. Oregon and Adkins v. Children's Hospital in a decision that overturned a minimum wage law for women in the nation's capital. The administration of the lackluster President Warren G. Harding became one of the most corrupt in the nation's history. Although his cabinet had a few men of talent and integrity, such as Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes and Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, Harding appointed cronies who used their office for private gain. The most famous of several corruption scandals involved the leasing of government oil reserves to businessmen in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, by Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, who was paid $500,000 for his services. As a result, Fall became the first cabinet member in history to receive a felony conviction. This cartoon is titled "This Decision Affirms Your Constitutional Right to Starve," a 1923 cartoon criticizing the Supreme Court decision declaring unconstitutional a Washington, D.C. law establishing a minimum wage for women. Justice George Sutherland, appointed to the court the previous year by President Warren G. Harding, wrote the majority decision. Harding's successor, Calvin Coolidge, who won fame while governor of Massachusetts for using state troops to end a Boston policeman's strike in 1919, was uncharismatic, but compared to Harding, he seemed like an honest Yankee. Coolidge continued Harding's policies, including twice vetoing the McNary-Houghton bill, but without the corruption and scandal. In 1924, Coolidge was reelected by a huge margin, defeating Democratic candidate John W. Davis, a Wall Street lawyer who had been nominated by a badly divided Democratic convention. 1/6 of the electorate in 1924 voted for Robert La Follette, a candidate of a new progressive party, whose platform called for higher taxes on the wealthy, public ownership of railroads, farm relief, and a ban on child labor. Coolidge described the progressive platform as a plan for a communistic and socialistic America. La Follette won the endorsements of progressives like Jane Addams and the American Federation of Labor, but he raised little money and carried only Wisconsin. Nonetheless, his candidacy showed that discontent persisted under the surface of prosperity and conservatism. Foreign affairs also reflected the alliance between business and government. The decade saw a retreat from Wilsonian internationalism towards unilateral American actions that were mostly intended to boost exports and investment opportunities abroad. I'm sorry, exports, not experts, and investment opportunities abroad. This so called isolationism of the 1920s was a reaction against the disappointments over Wilson's aggressive military and diplomatic stances. The United States hosted the Washington Naval Arms Conference of 1922, which negotiated smaller navies for Britain, France, Japan, Italy, and the United States. But the country stayed outside of the League of Nations, and American tariffs were raised to their highest levels in history, repudiating Wilson's commitment to free trade. Foreign policy was largely developed in private economic relationships rather than government activity. The United States emerged from World War I as the world's major manufacturing and financial power. In the 1920s, New York bankers, sometimes acting alone and sometimes with help from the Harding and Coolidge administrations, made huge loans to European and Latin American governments. American industrial firms, especially in auto, agriculture, machinery, and electrical equipment manufacturing, established overseas plants to supply the world market and find cheaper labor. American investors gained control over raw materials such as copper in Chile and oil in Venezuela. When American economic interests seemed threatened, the government sent in the troops, invading once more in Nicaragua to suppress a nationalist revolt, which had long-term effects. This 1924 cartoon, commenting on the scandals of the Harding administration, shows the White House, Capitol, and Washington Monument having been sold to the highest bidder. And here we see progressive optimism, a satirical comment on Robert La Follette's campaign for president in 1924 as the candidate of the Progressive Party has a disheveled Westerner labeled Wisconsin, La Follette State, tied to a stake in a desert, while a goat dressed as a cowboy labeled Third Party heads off to bring the party's message to the uneducated East. Take it all in. There's a lot there. A German cartoon inspired by President Calvin Coolidge's dispatch of American troops to Nicaragua. While Coolidge insisted that the United States acted in the interest of preserving international order, residents of other countries often saw the United States as a grasping imperial power. And here we see Augusto Sandino, who led a rebellion against the U.S. military occupation in Nicaragua in the late 1920s. He was assassinated in 1935 by General Anastasio Somoza, who became a dictator and established a family dynasty that ruled Nicaragua until overthrown in 1979 by a popular movement known as the Sandistas. Our next focus question: why did the protection of civil liberties gain importance in the 1920s? In the 1920s, concern for civil liberties, that is, rights an individual may assert even against democratic majorities, became essential elements of American freedom. Wartime repression continued into the 1920s, with lynchings in the South, attacks on labor organizers, and artistic censorship. Some American writers and authors, including Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, became disillusioned enough to immigrate to Paris. Concern for civil liberties grew from the arrests of anti-war dissenters under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which prompted the formation of a group in 1917 that 3 years later became the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, still in existence today. For the rest of the 20th century, the ACLU took on many of the important legal cases that established the rights revolution in America. The ACLU helped inject meaning into traditional liberties such as freedom of speech and invented new rights, such as the right to privacy. But the ACLU began as a coalition of pacifists, progressives, and lawyers who were outraged by the violation of Americans' rights by the government during World War I. Before the war, the Supreme Court had done little to protect the rights of unpopular minorities. Initially, the court itself restricted civil liberties. In 1919, the court upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act and the conviction of Charles T. Schnecht, a socialist who sent anti-draft leaflets through the mail. Oliver Wendell Holmes spoke for the court when he declared that the First Amendment did not prevent Congress from prohibiting speech that presented a clear and present danger of inspiring illegal activity. Free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. This became the basis of Supreme Court decisions in future Supreme Court cases. But since it allowed public officials to determine what kind of speech was considered dangerous, it proved to be an arbitrary doctrine. In 1919, the court also upheld the conviction of Jacob Abrams and 5 other men for passing out pamphlets criticizing America's intervention in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. But a minority dissented, forming the basis for future defenses of free speech as necessary in the great marketplace of ideas later on in that decade. By the end of the 1920s, the court had invalidated state laws by making it illegal to advocate unlawful acts or changes in the political or economic system. A judicial defense of civil liberties was slowly being born. These are the defendants in United States v. Abrams on the day of their deportation to Russia in 1921. Jacob Abrams is on the right. They were convicted under the Espionage Act of 1918 for impeding the war effort by distributing pamphlets critical of American intervention in Russia after the Russian Revolution. Our next focus question: what were the major flashpoints between fundamentalism and pluralism in the 1920s? Not all Americans embraced modern urban culture and its religious and ethnic pluralism, mass entertainment, and sexual liberation. Evangelical Protestants felt threatened by an apparent decline in traditional values and the increased visibility of Catholicism and Judaism caused by immigration. They also opposed modernists within Protestant denominations who wanted to integrate science and religion and adapt Christianity to the new secular culture. Fundamentalists, who were convinced that the Bible's literal truth was the basis of Christian doctrine, started campaigns to exorcise modernism from Christianity and restrict individual freedoms. Billy Sunday, a professional baseball player who became a revivalist preacher, was perhaps the best known of the fundamentalists, and he was said to have preached to as many as 100 million people with messages damning Darwinism and drink. Fundamentalism flowered both in rural and urban areas, and it succeeded, through prohibition, in reducing the consumption of alcohol in many places. But many Americans saw prohibition as a violation of their personal freedoms. Prohibition also earned huge profits for those who trafficked in illegal alcohol, and it encouraged pervasive government corruption. The 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee exposed the division between traditionalism and the modern secular culture. John Scopes, a public school teacher, was arrested for violating a state law that prohibited the teachings of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. His trial attracted national attention and was carried on live national radio. To fundamentalist Christians, the idea that humans had evolved over millions of years from simian ancestors contradicted the Bible's account of creation. To Scopes' defenders, including the ACLU, freedom meant the right to engage in independent thought and self-expression, and the Tennessee law showed the dangers of mixing church and state. The well-known lawyer Clarence Darrow defended Scopes and created a sensation when he called William Jennings Bryan to the stand as an expert witness on the Bible. Remember William Jennings Bryan from the Cross of Gold and his many runs for president in the previous chapter. Bryan showed a near-complete ignorance of modern science and an inability to deflect Darrow's sarcastic interrogation regarding the factual accuracy of biblical stories. The embarrassed Bryan died shortly after the trial ended in a guilty verdict for Snopes, though the decision was later overturned, and the movement for anti-evolution state laws expired. The battle would be fought again in the late 20th century when fundamentalism reemerged as a political force. Here we see a 1923 lithograph by George Bellows capturing Billy Sunday and his dynamic style of evangelical preaching in the 1920s. Yeah, they were like that. Federal agents with confiscated liquor in Colorado in the 1920s. Very shortly after Prohibition, they would break the bottles, and you can see the liquid all over the dirt below them. With the coming of Prohibition, the U.S. borders with Canada and Mexico divided wet and dry nations. This photo shows the scene on the Canadian side of the border with the state of Washington. 100 feet into Canada, billboards welcome America to a country where it's still legal to consume alcohol. And this is the border between Mexico and the United States, which also divided dry and wet nations. You can see American automobiles parked in front of bars in the border city of Tijuana, Mexico. Here is the Scopes trial. Because of the extreme heat, as well as the Spanish American flu epidemic, some sessions of this trial had to be held outdoors in front of the courthouse in Dayton, Tennessee. A photographer snapped this picture of the trial's climactic moment when Clarence Darrow, seen here standing in the center, questioned William Jennings Bryan, seated in front of him, about his interpretations of the Bible. Many rural and small town native born Protestants found immigrants and their cultures strange and threatening. In the 1920s, wartime demands for 100% Americanism persisted in public policy and behavior. The most militant expression of beliefs that American freedom's enjoyment should be limited according to religion and ethnicity was the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s. By the mid-1920s, the group claimed more than 3 million members, almost all white and native-born Protestants, many of whom were not in the South, but rather in the North and the West. Going beyond attacks on blacks, the new Klan targeted immigrants, especially Jews and Catholics, and other forces, feminism, unions, immorality, that seemed to threaten American civilization and, quote, individual liberty, end quote. Although the Klan's influence waned by the end of the decade, its attacks on modern secularism and political radicalism and its insistence that the control of the nation must be returned to the citizens of old stock represented popular sentiments. Many new laws transformed national identity and citizenship with new exclusive definitions and restrictions. Immigration policy was the most representative of this shift. Restrictions on immigration were nothing new given the Naturalization Act of 1790, which barred non-whites from migration, and the exclusion of various groups after 1875, including prostitutes and anarchists. Nonetheless, before World War I, the nation's doors were open to almost all white persons. In the 1920s, however, pressures for the restriction of immigration became overwhelming, which were signaled more than anything by the decline in traditional opposition to the restriction from employers who had welcomed the large labor supply as a check on higher wages. Fear of immigrant-based political radicalism now outweighed demands for cheap labor, which employers found in African Americans who had left the South. A 1921 law restricted immigration from Europe to 357 people per year. In 1924, Congress imposed a permanent limitation on European immigration to 150,000 per year, to be distributed according to a series of national quotas that sharply restricted the numbers from Southern and Eastern Europe in order to ensure that the descendants of old immigrants would always outnumber those of the new. The 1924 law barred the entry of all those ineligible for naturalized membership, all of whom were Asians, except for Filipinos, who were designated American nationals. But in 1934, Congress established a timetable for the Philippines' independence, largely as a way to end immigration from the islands. The 1924 law effectively created for the first time the category of illegal alien, and with it, the Border Patrol, which was charged with policing the land boundaries of the United States and empowered to arrest people and deport people who had entered the country in violation of these new nationality quotas and other restrictions. The new immigration law demonstrated the intensified influence of race on public policy. By the early 1920s, both Northern and Southern political leaders agreed that blacks should be second-class citizens. But race policy did not only concern blacks, but also involved the question of who would be American, particularly with regard to immigration. President Coolidge's Secretary of Labor, James J. Davis, argued that immigration policy, while once based on labor needs and the idea of America as an asylum of liberty, should now rest on the biological definition of the ideal of population. The law also reflected progressive interests in improving the quality of democratic citizenship and showed progressive goals were infused with pseudoscientific ideas about superiority and inferiority of particular races. The Supreme Court admitted that the entire concept of race, which was used to determine the immigration quotas, lacked a scientific basis when it rejected claims of an Indian born World War II veteran who wanted to become naturalized that he was a pure Aryan and therefore white. The court argued that white was not a scientific concept, but rather part of a common speech, to be interpreted with the understanding of the common man. In 1926, members of the Ku Klux Klan in full regalia paraded in front of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Unlike the Klan of Reconstruction era, the Second Klan was more powerful in the North and West than in the South. And here we see a scene from a series of murals painted in 1933 by Thomas Hart Benton for Chicago's Century of Progress exhibition, now displayed at Indiana University. This shows scenes of Americans at work and play. Benton's inclusion at the center of a Ku Klux Klan rally hints at the darker side of politics and culture in the 1920s. The newspaper man at his typewriter symbolizes the role of the press in exposing the Klan's nefarious deeds. This comic is titled The Only Way to Handle It, a political cartoon from 1921 endorsing immigration restriction. The immigration laws of 1924 established the Border Patrol to stop those barred from entry from sneaking into the United States from Mexico. At first, the Border Patrol was in modest operation. Here, 2 officers policed the border in California. Some Americans resisted the notion that Southern and Eastern Europeans could not become citizens or could only do so by adopting Anglo-Saxon culture. Horace Kallen, who was German-Jewish origins, coined the phrase cultural pluralism to describe a society that celebrated ethnic diversity instead of suppressing it. Kallen argued that the toleration of differences was uniquely American. Anthropologists such as Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict insisted that no basis existed in science for theories of racial superiority or a hierarchy of civilizations, but their writings had little effect on public policy. The new immigrants themselves were the best advocates for a pluralist America. Each ethnic group established its own ethnic enclaves with their own institutions, churches, theaters, and newspapers. Nevertheless, they were integrated into American culture through a mass consumption and mass culture. Immigrant groups facing prohibition, the Klan, and widespread anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism affirmed the validity of cultural diversity and defined the toleration of differences as an essential quality of American freedom. They reinvented themselves as ethnic Americans, claiming an equal right to participate in American life while remaining culturally distinct. Catholics and Jews celebrated their religious and ethnic culture without surrendering their belief that they should not experience discrimination or bigotry in public life. The Supreme Court helped secure this shift in law by striking down a Nebraska statute prohibiting the instruction in languages other than English, which had been intended to ban the teaching of German from education. The decisions gave pluralism a constitutional foundation and paved the way for the court's elaboration of a constitutional right to privacy. This is the Zion Lutheran Church in Nebraska, where Robert Meyer was arrested for teaching a Bible lesson in German in violation of state law. This led to the landmark Supreme Court case of Meyer v. Nebraska, an important rebuke to World War I xenophobia. This decade also saw a rising Black self-consciousness, especially in the North's urban ghettos. Almost 1 million Blacks had left the South in the Great Migration, moving to New York, Chicago, and countless smaller cities. Harlem in New York became the center of African American life, attracting migrants from the South and West Indies, among whom were many well-educated professional and white-collar workers who were shocked by American racism. Whites slummed in Harlem, visiting its dance halls, jazz clubs, and speakeasy, and contributing to depictions of Harlem as a place of primitive passions. But the real Harlem was a place of poverty and low wage work created and reinforced by housing discrimination. Harlem contained a dynamic black cultural community with connections to New York's artistic mainstream. Poets and novelists such as Langston Hughes and Claude McKay were sponsored by white intellectuals and published by white presses, and for the first time, Broadway presented black actors in serious roles, as well as in shows that featured black singers. In art, the term New Negro meant rejecting established stereotypes and engaging in a search for black values to replace them. This led the writers of what became the Harlem Renaissance to the roots of the Black experience in Africa, the rural South's folk culture, and urban life in the ghetto. Here we see a Black family arriving in Chicago in 1922 as part of the Great Migration from the rural South. Now, letters like this are thankfully illegal, but at the time it was quite acceptable socially and even expected for people to reject colored people or African Americans to any sort of advanced schooling. Segregated institutions sprang up to serve the Black communities created by the Black migration. Here we see Black residents of the nation's capital enjoying an outing at Suburban Gardens, a Black-owned amusement park. Our next focus question: what were the causes of the Great Depression, and how effective were the government's responses by 1932? Herbert Hoover seemed destined for a successful term as president. The son of an Iowa blacksmith and a schoolteacher, Hoover had made a fortune as a mining engineer in Asia, Africa, and Europe. He became famous for coordinating food relief in Europe during World War I. Hoover exemplified what was called the new era of American capitalism. In 1922, while he was Secretary of Commerce, Hoover published American Individualism, in which he condemned government regulation as an interference with the economic opportunities of ordinary Americans. Yet he also argued that self-interest should be subordinated to the public interest. Hoover thought himself a progressive, but he preferred what he termed associational action, in which private agencies directed regulatory and welfare policies to government intervention in the economy. When Coolidge declined to run for president, Hoover won the Republican nomination, celebrated the era's prosperity, and promised an end to poverty. He faced Alfred E. Smith, a Democrat and the first Catholic presidential nominee of a major party. Smith had been born into poverty on New York's Lower East Side, became a Tammany Hall politician, and although Irish, emerged as a spokesman for the new immigrants. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire caused him to support progressive social legislation, and in his 3 terms as New York's governor, he secured laws limiting working hours for women and children. Smith denounced the Red Scare and called for a repeal of prohibition. The Democratic platform substantively differed from the Republicans only on one issue: prohibition. Smith's Catholicism became the primary campaign issue and symbolized a culture clash between native-born Protestant whites and new immigrants. Although Hoover rode on the prosperity of the decade and was elected by 58% of the vote, Smith's campaign, which won the support of urban voters and farmers, laid the basis for the triumphant Democratic coalition of the 1930s. This is a 1928 campaign poster for the Republican ticket of Herbert Hoover and Charles Curtis. And here you see the results of the 1928 presidential election. They only got 58% of the vote, but that was enough to give them 83% of the Electoral College vote. Now that's a landslide. Here we see President Herbert Hoover on the front row right during the opening day of a baseball game in Washington, D.C., April 17, 1929. On October 29, 1929, a day that soon became known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. A panic ensued, and in 5 hours, $10 billion in market value had quickly disappeared. The United States quickly found itself in what became known as the Great Depression, which was the greatest economic calamity in modern history. Signs of the impending disaster were visible before October 1929. Southern California and Florida had experienced spectacular real estate booms and busts, which resulted in failed banks and foreclosed mortgages. The highly unequal distribution of income and the persistent depression in farming areas reduced Americans' purchasing power. Sales of new autos and consumer goods stagnated after 1926, and European demand for American goods also declined. A bursting of the stock market bubble had created in the 1920s by speculators was inevitable, but when it happened, it was so severe that it destroyed many investment companies, wiping out thousands of investors and squelching consumer confidence. Around 26,000 businesses failed in 1930, and those that survived cut back on employment and investment. The financial system, which was based on the gold standard, could not effectively meet the downturn. Germany defaulted on its reparation payments to France and Britain, which in turn stopped repaying their debts to the United States. Banks failed throughout the world as depositors drew out money and millions of families lost their life savings. Stocks briefly rebounded but soon resumed their precipitous decline. In 1932, the economy hit rock bottom, with the GNP down by a third, prices down by 40%, and more than 11 million workers, about 25% of the labor force, unemployed. Those who had jobs faced reduced wages and hours. Every industrial economy suffered, but the United States was hit the hardest. The Depression quickly transformed Americans' lives as hundreds of thousands took to the road to look for work, stood in bread lines, and erected shack cities called Hoovervilles. Cities exhausted their relief funds for the poor. The Depression actually reversed the long-standing migration of Americans from farms to cities as people tried to find land to grow food for their families. The suicide rate rose to the highest level in American history, and the birth rate dropped to its lowest. Also damaged was the public image of big business and Wall Street, which were shown to have thrived on shady dealings such as the sale of worthless bonds. This is a stock advertisement from 3 months before the stock market crash. The magazine of Wall Street is avidly encouraging readers to purchase stocks. October 29th, Dies Irae, a 1929 lithograph by James Rosenberg, depicts the skyscrapers tottering, stockbrokers jumping from the windows, and crowds panicking as the stock market crashes. The title means Day of Wrath. Here we see unemployed men lining up outside of a Chicago soup kitchen in 1931. Charitable institutions like this one were overwhelmed by the advent of the Great Depression. This graph illustrates the rapid rise and dramatic collapse of stock prices and the number of shares traded during the 1920s and early 1930s. And here we see police battling bonus marchers in Washington, D.C., July 1932. Soon afterwards, President Hoover sent federal troops to evict the marchers. Many Americans responded to the Depression with resignation or blamed themselves for their economic woes. Others responded with protests that were at first spontaneous and lacking in coordination because the unions, socialist groups, and others that might have led them had been devastated in the 1920s. In early 1932, 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans who marched on Washington to demand the early payment of a bonus due in 1945 were dispersed by federal troops. Throughout America, demonstrations by the unemployed demanded work and relief. Farmers protested the low prices by temporarily blocking roads to prevent goods from getting to market. The small Communist Party was the only group that seemed able to channel and direct the discontent. Communists formed the unemployed councils that organized marches, demonstrated for public assistance, and opposed evictions of unemployed families. The newspapers discussed the idea that America was close to a revolution. To many Americans, President Hoover's response to the Depression seemed inadequate and lacking in compassion. His advisors told him that the depressions were a normal function of capitalism that removed uncompetitive firms and encouraged moral virtue among the unfortunate. Businessmen vehemently opposed federal assistance for the jobless, and many suggested that individuals would survive the Depression through thrift. Federal policymakers who had never faced an economic crisis of this magnitude did not realize the extent to which consumer spending supported much of the economy. Most of them did not believe that federal assistance to the unemployed would spur economic recovery. Hoover maintained his commitment to associational action, strongly opposed to direct federal economic intervention, and believed that private charity and voluntary action by business to keep up investment and employment would suffice. He called together business and labor leaders and established commissions to encourage firms to coordinate maintaining prices and wages without government regulation. Hoover's public reassurances that the economy was recovering clashed with reality and made him seem ignorant of the problems facing many ordinary Americans. This is a Hooverville, a shanty town created by homeless squatters. This one is located outside Seattle, Washington, 1933. The Communist Party headquarters in New York, 1932. The banner illustrates a variety of activities the party organized in the early 1930s. Some of Hoover's actions, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised already high taxes on imported goods, caused other nations to retaliate, which decreased international trade and exacerbated the crisis. A tax increase that Hoover won from Congress in order to balance the budget further reduced consumers' purchasing power. By 1932, even Hoover conceded that voluntary measures were insufficient. He signed laws creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned money to failing banks, railroads, and other businesses, and the Federal Home Loan Banking System, which gave aid to homeowners threatened with foreclosure. Although he had vetoed bills to create employment and public works projects like road and bridge construction, he now approved $2 billion for such projects and for local relief. But Hoover refused to do anything further, including providing direct aid to the unemployed, which he told Congress would be a disservice to the jobless. In the mid 1920s, some intellectuals worried that the prevailing notion of freedom in America celebrated unbound economic enterprise, yet accepted limits on free speech and expression and other civil liberties. Though the prosperity of the 1920s reinforced this laissez faire conception of freedom, the Great Depression and Hoover's failed response discredited it. By 1932, the basis for a new conception of freedom based on progressive style positive state action in the economy and a respect for civil liberties and cultural pluralism was already present and would become the foundation of the modern 20th century liberalism. These are cameramen at the White House during the presidency of Herbert Hoover. Hoover never became comfortable with dealing with the mass media. And here we see an unemployed woman and man selling apples on a city street during the Great Depression. People were willing to do anything to make money. They had to. Here are a review of our focus questions during this lecture. Our next lecture is going to deal with the New Deal and how this changed the concepts of America and changed our notions of freedom. I hope you've enjoyed this. As ever, if you have any feedback or questions, please don't hesitate to email me. Have an amazing week.